It's been about 9 months since we last got a balance patch, and Blizzard has finally released a pretty big list of potential incoming changes. Now I'm going to be trying to review them for you guys from the POV of a Terran player, the POV of an ex-pro player, and a content creator. Obviously the entertainment pretty important for you guys and my challenges. And I'd like to ask you guys as well, make sure to comment below what your favorite changes are, your least favorite changes, and also add maybe what change you would have liked to see instead. I know you guys are very creative, so let me know. Now let's get into it. StarCraft 2 5.0.11 PTR patch notes. Now, my favorite change is actually a little bit later, but we're going to start with the Zerg changes. So the first bunch of changes are a few changes to creep. I think nerfing creep in general is a really good idea. I always felt like Zerg creep is a little bit overwhelming, I want to say. I feel like everyone who's played ladder against Zerg has had a moment where you're just macroing up. At some point, you decide to leave your base, and the creep is already there, and you're just... well, I guess I'll just stay at home, because we've all had an experience before. You move out on creep, you get absolutely steamrolled, and it sucks, right? And I felt like it would always be good to take a little bit of strength away from creep and maybe give it to their units instead. And that way you kind of remove two problems at once. I feel like one problem you remove is, if you guys didn't know, at the top, Zerg is very dominant. I think they've won the last 8 World Championships, and it's because if you as Zerg become so good at the basic mechanics, sometimes they tend to feel a little bit unbeatable. But at the same time, lower level Zergs are going to struggle an insane amount by actually spreading creep and with those insane mechanics. So I feel like by taking strength away from creep and putting it back to the normal units, I want to say, I think it's a good change for both of those reasons. Now, that being said, this change, I don't think it's really going to have a massive impact. If you guys can tell me how many Zergs you think actually spread their creep terminus in 11 seconds instead of 13 plus, I'd be curious if you guys think it's more than like 3 Zergs, to be honest. Like, I don't think it's really going to matter that much. Maybe Serral's creep spread is going to be delayed a little bit, but besides that, I don't think it's really going to have a massive impact, which is okay. I mean, I think it's a step in the right direction. If they really wanted to nerf creep, there's definitely a better way to do it than this. Now, the side range is going to be reduced by 1. I think this was actually more intended to be a bit more logical, because I think 11 is 1 more range, then you can actually spread the creep. So putting it back to 10 puts it at the same range as you can actually spread creep, so it's a little bit easier to see what the creep can actually see. It's not like sometimes you fly past the creep with a Banshee, like just past the coastline of the creep, and you're not even sure if they really saw you or not. But I guess with this change, it's going to be a little bit easier to see, which is nice, and obviously it is a small nerf as well. Now, there's a second part to this. Hatchery, lair, and hive. Creep spread interval decreased from 0.3 to 0.25. If I understand this correctly, this just means that the creep from the hatchery spreads a little bit faster when it's built. I don't think this really has a massive impact. I guess this might make it a little bit easier to perhaps wall off in a ZVZ against a link flood, that kind of stuff. Besides that, I'm actually not quite sure exactly what that change was meant for. And then the side range increased. This sounds like a buff. In reality, this is another one of those changes kind of similar to this first side range change, where it just makes a little bit more sense. Like, if you guys have never watched a Spinecrawler rush in ZVZ, if someone has just a hatchery and nothing to spot, you can just put a Spinecrawler at the edge of the creep and they actually can't see it. And it feels very weird that the Zerg does not have vision there in the creep from the hatchery, right? So I think this just makes a little bit more sense. It does remove one funny cheese, which I think might not be necessarily the direction you want the game to go in. I don't think it's a good idea to remove all cheese from the game, but in the end, it does make more sense, so I think it's a logical change. All in all, these changes, I don't think are going to be super impactful. I think some of the ideas are cool, especially nerfing the creep a little bit, especially with probably buffing some units down here later on, but I don't think it's going to be super impactful. Now, we have another change for the Viper. Added 0.71 second cast finish time to abduct. Cannot move or use any other abilities during this time. This is actually a change I like a lot. If you watch the highest level of Zerg play, the way they use Vipers is usually very cool. So what they do is they just have 1 Viper, 2 Vipers, 3 Vipers together with their air army. And when they see an opportunity, they yoink, they abduct a carrier or a Thor, and they kill it off. Now, since the abduct was so spammable before, I think very much what happened instead was people would just have 5 Vipers, and if for some reason you weren't paying attention, they could just yoink 10 tanks or 10 Thors or 10 carriers instantly. And that's a little bit of a problem. I guess carriers didn't happen so much. So this is going to fix that a little bit. Now it's going to be back to the cool usage where instead of spamming spells, you're just going to be able to abduct one Thor, one carrier at a time. And I think that's a very cool way to use the Viper. And this may even encourage lower level players to use the Viper correctly instead of just trying to spam all the units at once, or all the abilities at once rather. So I think this is pretty cool. Especially against in ZVP, I think this is going to have the most impact. Terran usually counters Vipers with Ghost these days, but against Protoss, very often they would be able to grab 2 carries or 4 carries at once. And now it's just going to be 1 carrier, which seems a little bit more fair. It rewards good micro by the Zerg, and it doesn't punish the Protoss too hard when they're, you know, not paying attention for 1 second. So all in all, I think this is a pretty good change. And there's actually a situation in ZVZ, not sure if you guys have ever seen this. I don't think late game is very common at all anymore in ZVZ, but what I used to see a lot is the perfect late game in ZVZ is just Lurker Viper. Nothing counters Lurker Viper, quite literally. And if Vipers abduct each other, they actually switch places. They don't meet in the middle. They quite literally switch places. And since you can spam abduct right now, what you would see a lot is just like a million Vipers abducting each other and switching places. And it kind of becomes a little bit of a clown fiesta rather than maybe a little bit more of a fight with a tactical approach where you try to get 1 or 2 Vipers from the side. So I think this change probably fixes all of those things, which is nice. Then the Ultralisk is getting a little bit of a buff here. Reduced size by 12.5%. This is mostly... Ultras are very clumsy. They're big. And a lot of time in the fights, you'll see them being stuck behind Zerglings or Banelings or whatever. And they don't really, you know, even get to fight. So I think this is a pretty good change. Ultralisk also hasn't been the strongest unit ever. I think situationally it's very good. But all in all, hasn't been the strongest unit. So I think it's pretty cool that this unit is getting a buff. I also think, as someone who was a Brood War kid, I used to play Brood War when I was like 6 years old. I think Ultralisk is a really iconic unit, to be honest. And I think it's cool that it's getting a little bit of attention. Now, the second point is increase range slop from 1 to 1.4. Range target can move before miss. This is... I'm not sure if it's me, but this line sounds very confusing. It took me a while to figure out what it means. I think what it means is that right now, if you kite away from Ultras, if you run away as it's hitting you, sometimes the hit kind of cancels and it doesn't hit you. And I feel like what this says is... you can actually hit the target a bit longer when it's running away, so it's harder to kite. I believe that's what it says. So that's another little bit of a buff to the Ultralisk. I do have to say, even though I like the attention the Ultralisk are getting by buffing them a little bit, and this is, you know, assuming I'm understanding this correctly, right, is... Ultralisks are honestly quite good. Again, in ZVT, for example, they're quite good against Bio anyway. The main problem is that they just get absolutely shredded by Ghosts. So I'm not sure if you really need to buff them against Marine Marauder in that way. But all in all, I'm a fan of buffing the Ultralisk a little bit. I think it's pretty cool. And I guess we're going to have to see what other changes come. I do have to say, this is actually a little bit spoiler for later in this video. But all of these might be bad news in combination with a Terran change that we're going to see later. But we'll get to it at this point. Now, they're also going to give a buff to the Hydra. Muscular Augments, that's, you know, the move speed upgrade is going to get a little bit of a bonus, so they're going to be even faster. To me, this sounds alright. I feel like the Hydralisk is a slightly underused unit. The Hydralisk is mostly strong because it morphs into a Lurker for the most part. So I guess it's alright that we're going to buff this unit. I think it's pretty cool. I have seen some tweets that the Hydra is now so fast, like turbo speed, that it's as fast as battle mech units. I'm not sure if this is the case, because to me... this does not sound like a massive speed increase. Maybe it's just like the perception of people. They see the unit and it just looks really fast. To me, it doesn't sound like it's going to be that much faster. Maybe it also gives like more speed bonus on creep or something. But yeah, I think it's alright to buff the Hydra. It's, once again, for me, pretty iconic unit. Though it's way different than in Brood War, but still pretty iconic. So that's cool. And I'm always a really big fan. It's actually, I have 3 goals for this balance patch to achieve. I'm going to share them with you later. And I'm going to tell you guys if this patch hit the mark. But I think buffing underused units is definitely a big point of mine. I love to have more options, be able to use different units. I think a particular Zerg play is so figured out that sometimes it feels like Zergs do the same every single game, because they know exactly what to do, what the winning condition is, and that's it. So I would love for them to have some more options as well. Perhaps you would have to tone them back a little bit, so not every option is really good, right? But I think it's really cool to have some more options. I hope for Protoss and Terran to get the same thing. And then damage point reduced from 0.15 to 0.1. This is another thing that I feel like a lot of people don't know what it means. I also didn't really know until I saw someone write about it. Apparently this means that is like the delay between like the animation and actually dealing damage. So what this means is you can actually kite, for example. You can kite a little bit better, you can micro a little better, you can hit and run a little bit faster. So it's also just another small buff to the Hydra, which sounds pretty nice. Now we're gonna get to a buff I'm a little bit scared about. And I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a history talk here. Brute Lord move speed increased from 1.97 to 2.3. So that's a bigger buff than this one, for example. And the reason why I'm scared is, to be fair, Brute Lords haven't been the strongest units recently. But historically, the two worst moments in StarCraft history, balance-wise, it's actually, I guess it's both, is surrounding the Brute Lord, right? Like in 2012, I'm not sure how many of you have been around for that long in StarCraft 2, but in 2012, it was basically a catastrophe for the game. Brute Lord Infestor was so strong, people quit the game, the viewership got cut in half, casters stopped casting the game, literally no exaggeration, because Brute Lord Infestor was so strong. And the problem with Brute Lord Infestor being that strong is that it's also the most boring composition in the game. The way these games look like is Zerg sit behind a fort of Spore Crawlers, the army is unbeatable, and a very slow army just moves forward step by step and just kind of walks over everything or flies. So for that reason, I'm really scared when they buffed the Brute Lord. In 2019, Brute Lord Infestor was also incredibly strong. Now, this was always in combination with the Infestor, and I believe there's no Infestor buff in here, so that's good. We're probably safe, but you guys can understand I'm a little bit traumatized when I see a Brute Lord buff. I'm like, oh no, take it out, please. But this one, it seems pretty reasonable. I do have to say, this one is actually the same part. It's a Bruteling, which comes from the Brute Lord. It is the right direction of changing a Brute Lord, because Brutelings are very oppressive. If there's few too many Brute Lords, your entire army can't move, and you can't even really fight, which tends to feel a little bit bad. It's a little bit frustrating. So giving the Brute Lord a little bit of what do you call it, strength in other areas rather than a Bruteling, and nerfing the Bruteling a little bit, that seems like it's going in the right direction. Definitely, you know, if they were going to buff the Brute Lord, this is probably the way to go. I do have to say, you could say this is a neutral for the Brute Lord, but I would say this is 100% a buff, because Brutelings going for 5.71 seconds to 3.57. Brutelings are still going to block all your units, and Brutelers are going to keep attacking. So I don't think the effect of the Bruteling is going to be diminished by that much. You're still going to want to run away when your army is being attacked by Brutelings. And at the same time, it's getting a movement speed increase. So I would say, all in all, this is definitely a Brutelord buff. But since the Infestor's not getting buffed, I think we're safe, like I mentioned before. But it's probably the scariest change so far, I have to say. And then I believe there's one more change for Zerg, which is actually a little bit of a Ravager nerf. This change, I want to say, is mostly for ZVP. Because what you see against Protoss a lot is that Zerg makes like basically no units. They have a few roaches. And then as soon as the Protoss attacks, they just morph all their roaches into Ravagers, and that's their defense. And this change is going to force them a little bit more to actually be on time with the defense rather than to have a very fast spawn the defense button, which I think it's good. It's good to have a little bit of anticipation there instead of just, you know, being able to drone up like crazy and then make your defense last second. Obviously, you still need to have your roaches in time. But I think it's going to be a little bit more fair in that way, that they actually have to prepare a little bit faster. I think for ZVZ and ZVT, this is really not going to have much of an impact. Against Terran, you already morph the Ravagers when you attack. If you're morphing Ravagers to defend, I don't really see any situation at the high level where that occurs, to be honest. And in ZVZ, I feel like, you know, you both make Ravagers, so it's always kind of fair in that way anyway. Now we're getting into the Protoss changes, and I think a lot of you are going to love some of these changes. You can see the word shield battery already. A lot of you are going to like that. Just want to ask you guys, if you do enjoy this content, make sure to like the video and leave a comment. I do look at the stats on my videos, so if you guys enjoy this kind of content and want to see more of it, obviously that means like yearly, because we don't get a lot of patches, but I don't know, so make sure to do that. Now the Protoss changes, the first one, actually that's actually a pretty big list, can't even get it all on one screen. The first one is one to my heart. I've been wanting for this to happen for so long. Shield battery overcharge recharge rate reduced from 200% to 150%. If you guys don't know, the Nexus now has an ability called Battery Overcharge. It powers a shield battery, turns it green. You guys might have heard of the term green battery or nuclear battery or something like that. It makes it heal an absolutely incredible amount. And the gameplay that this creates is not typically that Protoss takes a better fight, what happens instead is this battery is so strong that you just kind of have to run. So on certain maps, where the third and fourth base are very far apart, and to attack you have to walk like all the way around, what happens is they kind of just always pop the battery and you never get to attack, and it creates a game where you simply can't make anything happen. And I feel like this kind of gameplay is very boring. I feel like if the battery overcharges 150% instead, maybe the fights are going to be better for Protoss, but it's not that insane that you can't attack into it with like a massive supply lead. And I think that's a very good change. I feel like the battery overcharge that it is right now, it heals so much that I'm pretty sure I've backed away from fights where I'm 60 supply up because it's just that strong. Now, obviously, it is situational. Some situations that I can think of that you would run away from is if you fight against Colossi and you have 8 Vikings, you are not going to kill them under a battery, so all you can do is run away or fly away. And that, you know, is very boring gameplay, so I think this is a really good change. And what I love is that they actually did keep it, because a lot of people want, like, even the shield battery to be straight up removed, but Protoss simply needs some defensive tools like that to defend. So I think it's a good change. I'm not sure about the number exactly. To me, it sounds good, but maybe it's a little bit too strong still. Maybe it's a little bit too weak. Who knows? I think it's probably in the right spot. They're going to be able to defend stuff, but it's not going to be that absurd that you have to run away no matter what. So that's good. Now, there's a couple of observer changes here. Move speed increased, so they're going to be a little bit faster, and model size increased as well. Now, this is actually one of my favorite changes here. It's probably something you guys wouldn't think about, because if you're going to complain, you're going to talk about shield battery, disruptors, carrier, stuff like that, right? But Observer is low-key one of the absolute best units Protoss has. If you guys haven't played Protoss against, let's say, Terran yourself, a Terran that likes to drop, you should play Protoss and just refuse to make observers, right? It's gonna be so hard to play the game. If you don't know, like, the thing with observers is you always see drops moving out, you see where they're going, your army is always in position, and then Protoss looks really strong. But if you have no vision, you don't know exactly how many Stalkers to put in your main, how to split your army between your third and your fourth, I think it's an absolute nightmare to play Protoss. Observer, actually one of the best units they have. And that's why the model size increase, why it helps so much, is because you can actually see it now. So I want to say I'm a pretty high level player, and sometimes I don't fight an observer the entire game. I've had people watching my streams and my videos saying, how did you see that observer? I'm looking at the replay and I still don't see it. And I think, it should be fair enough that you can actually see it. It probably forces Protoss to put them in smarter locations, which is always good. And then they compensate for making it a bit faster. And what this does is it rewards higher skill. So if you're good enough, you're not going to use the AFK mode. If you guys don't know what that means, you can actually put the observer in AFK mode. It gives more vision, but you can't move it around. So this makes it a little bit faster. It will reward players that are fast enough to actually move their observer around, rather than just putting it in the AFK mode in a certain spot. And if you put it in the AFK mode, it's also easier to see. So all in all, I think this is actually a great change. Archon can now fit between single gap walls. There's not too much to say about this, really. I think it's just a nice quality of life change. Very often what happens to Protoss players, I want to say particularly in PvZ, for example against Mutalisks, where in PvZ you always have to wall off your natural, and Archons don't fit in single gap walls. So you can't really move your Archons back and forth. If you ever morph Archons in your main, you can't get them out without a prism. And it's just pretty much an unnecessary hassle. Now, there is a counterpoint to be made where most of the time when Archons get stuck in the main, it's because Protoss recalls their entire army into the main base. In that case, I feel like it would be alright if the Protoss player gets punished, but I do think it's maybe a little bit too annoying. It's very frustrating, especially for lower level players. I've seen like top 5 European Protoss players do that, so I can only imagine how annoying it is if you're playing in like Platinum and stuff and your Archons are just stuck everywhere. So I think it's a really nice change. Now, here are some of the biggest changes in StarCraft. These are like perhaps like the 3 most hated units. Well, maybe not the High Templar, but these two definitely are 2 of the most hated units. So first of all, you might get a little bit of a heart attack seeing this, right? A High Templar buff? Are you crazy? I was thinking about it for a while. I couldn't place exactly why this change was here, but then I kind of realized that it was mostly in combination with a Disruptor nerf. This is, I swear you guys, especially for Terran players, for Zerg players it's probably nice, but Terran players are going to care so much. The Disruptor nerf feels like a gift from heaven, okay? Disruptors have been the most frustrating unit ever, and I'm gonna make a statement here, which I think a lot of people will agree with. Disruptor is probably one of the worst designed units ever in any RTS. Funny story about this is a Disruptor actually came out in early Legacy of the Void, back when StarCraft 2 still had an active balance team. And the balance team was always talking about, you know, we need to get rid of death balls, because in Heart of the Swarm and Wings of Liberty, very often Protoss would just max out, and Terran would just max out, and you would have these big fights, and that's it, rather than like some cool battles everywhere. And then what they did was make a literal death ball. So now there's a death ball that shoots death balls that one-shots all the units, which is just... I mean, the thing is, if you play PvP at a very high level, you can probably, you know, micro very well against it and it could be okay. But now and then the games where you just lose 30 supply to one unit that you didn't see, it's not fun, man. It's awful. So a Disruptor nerf, very, very welcome. Like I said, one of the worst designed units ever in my mind. So that's beautiful to see. Obviously, it's a 10% nerf, right? It might seem like it's not a big of a deal. I think it's a decent deal. You're definitely gonna lose... Let's say, very often what happens is the Disruptor Ball goes in, and it snipes like the last 4 Marauders that you have. Now, it's probably just gonna kill 2 Marauders, or 1. And I think it's actually gonna make a pretty big difference overall. Obviously, a Disruptor, you can't make it too small, else you might as well delete the unit, because the unit needs to have a point, right? It needs to be able to do damage. It's a pretty slow and killable unit after all. But I think any nerf to Disruptor is just... beautiful. It's probably 5 years too late, to be honest, but you know, at least it's there, and that's amazing. And I think the High Templar buff, like I said, is in combination with that. They probably want to shift people spamming Disruptors to people using High Templars a little bit more. In my opinion, I know a lot of people hate Storm. I think Storm is one of the cooler abilities, and it's because whenever I see Storm, I do get the feeling that you can micro against it. You can send like 3 Marauders forward, you can try to kill it. It's... you know, if you get hit by a Storm full on, it's really gonna hurt. But for most of the time, I feel like you can micro against it. It's definitely a way cooler form of splash than the Robo Bay units like Colossus and Disruptors. So I can kind of get it. One thing that does worry me a little bit is that I know, especially for Zergs, High Templar kind of seems like the strongest unit in the game. And I'm not a pro Protoss player or pro Zerg player, so I can't say this for 100%, but I've played some Zerg myself. And High Templar just straight up seems like the best unit in the game. So buffing it does seem a little bit worrisome for Zergs, perhaps. Especially in combination with carriers. But those, you know, are getting changes as well. But I think for a Terran POV, it seems like a fair trade. Storm is going to be powerful. Storm was already getting more popular, so we're going to have to see. But I think I would, any day of the week, take this freaking trade where they nerf Disruptors and buff Templars. I love it. If the Disruptor nerf wasn't here, I would maybe debate it a little bit more, okay? But in combination, I think it's completely fine. Now, carriers are getting some changes as well. Kind of similar to the creep thing. Well, actually, it's a little bit different. I feel like carriers are a unit that are not necessarily overpowered, but it should still get nerfed. And the reason for that is that carrier is... you know, it kind of sucks because, you know, I like my iconic units from Brood War and stuff, and Carrier is so iconic for Protoss, but the way it's worked out in StarCraft 2, it's just not that great of a unit design as well. I feel like most of the time I see, you know, I've watched my girlfriend play in Silver, I've watched my friend play in Diamond and Master League. If you play against mass carriers, you are probably just gonna die unless you have really good control. So I think carriers are a unit that should probably be a little bit on the weaker side, because every loss against it is super frustrating. Typically, sorry for the SkyToss players out there, but mass carriers is also a pretty low skill playstyle. Not very interesting. Most of the time you're just sitting in your base and not doing anything, making the unbeatable army. So even though it's not a massive nerf at all, I will always welcome a little bit of a carrier nerf. Now there are some really interesting topics here to discuss. Now, first of all, let's begin with the first one. Interceptor shields reduced from 40 to 30. It's 10 HP. Interceptors are just gonna die faster. It's a very simple nerf. I think this is mostly gonna matter for Bio. I think perhaps for Hydralisk as well. Keep in mind the Hydralisk is getting a buff, so maybe Hydras can kill Interceptors a little bit better. In my mind, you might still not really want to play Hydras against carriers, especially if they have Storm, right? But, you know, for Bio, it's going to be pretty huge. You'll be able to get Interceptors faster, which is fantastic. Maybe you get A-moved a little bit less, which is nice. As you guys can tell, I'm not a huge fan of the carrier either. Sorry out there, Protoss players. I think Protoss has so many interesting units. And then there's units like the carrier, which you just A-move people with. Like, it's just... I really think Protoss has amazing tools. You know, Oracles are freaking awesome. War Prisms are awesome. But the carriers is just not really my jam. Interceptor attack target priority reduced from 20 to 19. This is a very important one. I am not sure whether this is a buff or a nerf. I'm actually not quite sure. What this means is that if you A-move your army and your army is in range of the carriers, it's going to attack the carriers now instead of the interceptors. Now, in some situations, you actually do not want this. I think this is very important for ZVP. If a Zerg makes Corruptors, if Corruptors are attacking interceptors, you've lost. Like, Corruptors are going to kill them very slow, they're going to die, and that's it. But now, the Corruptors are going to attack the carriers instead automatically, which they're very good against. So I think at lower levels, Terrans and Zergs that try to counter carriers with Vikings and Corruptors are going to have a way better time, which is nice. I've seen a lot of times before, like I said, I've watched my girlfriend play in Silver. I've seen her make mass Vikings against carriers, but not target the carriers perfectly. They start attacking interceptors, and before you know it, you've lost 40 Vikings for 2 carriers, you know. So this is definitely going to be a massive change for that. If you play units that attack fast with a high DPS, like Marines and Hydras, for example, with those units, you would probably rather attack the interceptors instead. With Hydras, it's a bit of a debate. For Marines, you very likely want to attack the interceptors instead. So now you do have to do a little bit of additional micro instead of just A-moving. I think you probably are going to want to use hold position instead to actually target the interceptors down. All in all, I think it's a pretty good change. I feel like the units that are designed to kill carriers, like Vikings and Corruptors, are actually going to do a good job at that now without needing exceptional micro, and that's fantastic news. And then the third point is Inceptor flying radius around target increased. I actually do not really know what this means, to be honest. I'm not sure what impact it has, so I think I'll just skip that one for now. If you guys know what it means, you can leave it in the comments. I'll definitely read all the comments, but I'm actually not quite sure what it means. I guess maybe it's allowed to take more targets, like with more range or something. I'm actually really not quite sure. Probably shouldn't speculate about it. Now, Sentry build time is going to be reduced by 3.5 seconds. The way this is worded makes it sound like it's just a gateway thing and not a warp gate thing. So I'm just going to assume that is the case. Because if it's a warp gate thing, it should be noted as, you know, warp cooldown is reduced, not build time, right? And in that case, I would really like it. I think buffing sentries by 3.5 seconds, if it does include warp gate, would be a little bit weird, because sentries are not bad units at all, right? They're used pretty frequently. But if it's from a gateway, I really like this change, because what it does is it encourages people to make sentries to scout early on. And encouraging people to try legit playstyles, making it easier for them to scout, is always pretty good. Want to make the game a little bit less chaotic is always nice. I think it's important that cheese and stuff are still good, of course, but at least giving people the tools to scout is always going to be nice. If you can make a sentry as a second gateway unit, it builds 3.5 seconds faster. Oh, just so you guys know what I mean by scouting is sentries, they use hallucinations to scout. So you hallucinate a phoenix, very fast unit, fly over your opponent's base, and that's why it's a good scouting unit. It's the fastest scout you can have as Protoss. It's way faster than an observer or something like that. Unless you count an adept, of course, but an adept doesn't get into the main. So all in all, I think that's a pretty cool change. If it's also from the warp gate, which I don't think, it'd be a little bit more questionable, but there it is. Now, the forge upgrades are getting buffed. I am not sure if there's a direct reason for this. Just so you guys know, this patch is made by community members, which means pro gamers, basically. So if you guys are ever wondering about a change that seems a little bit crazy for the specific time, like why on earth would anyone buff Protoss upgrades, is most likely that the Protoss players wanted compensation for the nerfs or something like that, right? So I feel like there's no particular reason to buff upgrades. I think it's mostly just, you know, their carriers are getting nerfed and their disruptors. Is there anything else? And their battery overcharge. So they wanted like some kind of buff, which ended up being the upgrades. I think that's the most likely case. Otherwise, I don't know why they are getting buffed. Protoss upgrades. I think Protoss is always ahead in upgrades in both matchups, right? Typically. Or maybe since the new style fell out of fashion against Zerg for a while, Protoss was playing double forge with mass gateway units. They were always ahead in upgrades. I think it might have fallen out of fashion a little bit, so maybe it's not the case against Zerg anymore. But anyway, Protoss doesn't have any particular problems with upgrades, so I guess it is mostly just a compensation more than anything else. Now here we are gonna get, in my opinion, the most interesting changes of the thing. And this is also the most dangerous one. Keep in mind what I told you guys about the Zerg units, that in combination with this change it could be difficult. Well, here it is, the Ghost nerf. Enhanced Shockwaves upgrade removed. Base EMP radius increased from 1.5 to 1.75. These two are obviously linked. What Enhanced Shockwaves did was it improved EMP radius to 2. So you had really big EMPs. So what they did instead was they removed that upgrade and they just made the base EMP radius bigger, but smaller than with the upgrade. I can totally get this upgrade. To be fair, EMP with the Shockwaves upgrade, they kind of just blanketed an entire Protoss army, or like all the spellcasters. And in general, I'm not a huge fan of Massive Splash, similar to Disruptors, right? Not a huge fan of like the Massive Splash just kind of owning an entire army. So what this does is it makes Ghost a little bit better right out of the gate. So if your Ghost spawn, you can fight right away. They're going to be a little bit better, but they're not going to be like super absurd in the late game, which I can get behind. I think EMP is still going to be a really good upgrade. If you play against Protoss, a nice macro game with Terran, you want to make Ghost no matter what anyway. Even if they don't have Templars, you always make Ghost. I mean, I know this is supposed to be a patch review and not some tips, but just make Ghost, guys. They're pretty good. And then this is the most interesting change here, maybe the scariest one. Steady targeting, that's snipe by the way in common speech I guess, is cancelled if the target moves more than 13.5 range away from the Ghost while casting. Cast range is 10. Now, I have heard that you can run away from it relatively easily. Looking at these numbers, it doesn't sound like you can run away that easy, but I've heard that you can unburrow lurkers and get away, and you can actually cancel a lot of the snipes after getting sniped. That sounds like you can run away a little bit too easily, but it's... people always kind of manipulate the way it really is to make it sound worse or better, right? So I'm not quite sure exactly how bad it is. Now I'm going to explain you quickly the reason why I'm scared for this. Keep in mind, Zerg got a few buffs in the mid-late game, more mid-game than late game, but the Hydras and the Ultras and the Broodlords basically get a buff. And what is a little bit weird about that is that recently... keep in mind, I've retired from pro gaming, so I don't have like the first-hand experience of the last half a year or so myself. But I've watched a decent amount of games, and what I see a lot is that Zerg typically dominates the mid-game pretty hard. If Terrans try to attack outside of all-ins, more often than not they get owned. But Terran is very strong in the late game with the usage of Ghosts. So what is kind of scary here is that it seems like they're buffing the Zerg mid-game, which... is where Zerg is already really strong, and then they're nerfing the Ghost a little bit. Well, they should probably be doing it the other way around, where they nerf the Zerg mid-game a little bit and maybe buff the late game and take a bit of strength away from the Ghost, so Terrans can actually play the mid-game again instead of relying on Ghost. So that's why I think this is a little bit scary. That said, it does not seem like a massive nerf to Snipe. Snipe is definitely by far... excuse me. Snipe is by far the most important ability that a Ghost has against Zerg, against Protoss' EMP, of course. So if Snipe sucks, the Ghost is going to suck against Zerg, and Terran is going to suck against Zerg, right? But it doesn't seem like that big of a nerf that the Ghost is really going to suck, so that's good. If it does turn out that this makes the Ghost too weak, then this is going to have to be a change that needs to be reverted immediately, because if we take the meta we have now and nerf the Ghost and buff some Zerg mid-game units, it's gonna be bad for Terran. It's definitely gonna be very bad, so this is scary. But we're gonna have to see exactly how the numbers work out. I don't know yet. Personally, I'm not even really a huge fan of using the Ghost, so for me it's fine. I mostly like interesting changes. And that's where we're gonna get to now, guys. The Banshee. I've complained about it in all my Sky Terran to Grandmaster episodes. The upgrade that literally no one uses took 100... Take this in, guys. No one used this upgrade. It took 121 freaking seconds to build, okay? That is absolute insanity. And now they're going to change it back to 100. Honestly, they could make it 79 even, because it's such an underused upgrade. It's still not going to be insane. But I'm very happy that they're going to make alternative upgrades, units that people don't use a lot, upgrades that people don't use a lot. They're going to try to make them useful. And it's going to be a little bit cheaper. And I very much welcome this buff for the reason I just mentioned. Like, no one uses this besides me, I think. So it's going to be very nice that they're opening up some options. We're trying to open up some options. Now, once again, this could honestly be way less, because it's just not that strong of an upgrade. It's very cool, though. It's kind of like playing with toy cars. If you're a kid, you're just like, I am speed, you know? Like, they're very fast. It's very fun. But obviously, it's not the most impactful upgrade. There is not a single build order where you can really efficiently get Banshee speed, so they could make it a little bit stronger. But any step in the right direction, I'm all for, so that's really nice. Now, this is a crazy change. I didn't see this coming. I don't know if it's good for Cyclones, first of all. My first impression was that this is actually a little bit of a nerf, but it's an interesting idea. So, Macfield Accelerator damage bonus is going to change from +20 to armor to +10 versus all. Simply put, before, Cyclones did 20 damage versus everything, but 40 against armored. So they were super strong against, you know, stalkers, buildings, perhaps most importantly, siege tanks and stuff. And now they're going to do 30 damage against everything. I just think that there might not be that many targets you make Cyclones against that are not armored. Like, the few I can think of is, if you want to play Cyclomech against Protoss, you'll be making them against Zealots and Phoenixes, perhaps. So they're going to do a bit better against those. They're going to be a little bit better against... against Mutalisks, against Hydras, but I'm not sure if it weighs up to not being able to snipe buildings as well, not being able to kill hatcheries. You're going to kill roaches slower, stalkers, oracles, etc. Immortals, Colossus, tanks, Thors. Like, there's a lot of armored targets. So in the end, I think it could be a nerf in some way. But if it brings the Cyclone to a level where you can actually mass it because it's decent against everything instead of really good against some units, maybe it's a really good change. And anyway, I think it's an interesting change. I'm very curious to see if I can actually use them against Zealots now. Because I think it should be 5 shots against Zealots instead of 8, for example. Or maybe it's 6 shots against Zealots. But anyway, it's a pretty big difference. So maybe it's a good change. We'll find out. Obviously, you guys will be able to see me try them out. Now, Sensor Tower is getting a little bit of a nerf. A lot of people are against this, but Sensor Towers are honestly kind of broken. Just speaking as a Terran here, there's probably a lot of Terrans. You didn't just say that, you traitor. But Sensor Towers, well, I wouldn't say they're broken. They're very good, but more than anything, they also promote more boring gameplay a little bit, kind of similar to a battery overcharge. Obviously, Terrans are not always going to be good enough to have units in position, but it's very, very demotivating to attack in a place where there's a sensor tower, because your opponents can just see all your movements, and the only logical thought you can have is, oh, he sees everything I'm doing, he's going to be in position. Besides that, there are some maps that are small. Like, this is 30 is a very big range, right? If you play on Waterfall, a sensor tower sees half the map. Like, it's an incredible range, right? So I don't mind it getting a little bit of a nerf. I think it could be a bit annoying against Terran, like against drops and stuff. Like, they might be harder to stop, but at the same time, the TVT meta is also a little bit stale. Everyone knows how to play. It's very figured out. It's very passive gameplay, tanks, air control, and all that. So it's probably a very good thing that they're actually switching that up a little bit. And then the last change of it all, also a very interesting one. Like I said, I really like the Terran Changes. They're pretty sick. The Raven is going to get a complete rework. Basically, they're going to make it build faster, cost less, start with more energy, and make it weaker. Obviously, right? So it's going to be basically a very cheap Raven. Well, it's still 150 gas. It's going to be a cheaper, faster Raven. The more energy is a little bit misleading because you can do less with the energy. I feel like in terms of energy, it's probably about the same, really. The only change I don't like here is auto turret energy cost increase from 50 to 75. And the reason why I don't like it is that using auto turrets that cost 75 energy is just like, you're never going to want to do that. Like, keep this in mind. If you have a max energy Raven, 200 energy, you're going to have 2 auto turrets instead of 4. The reason why auto turrets were good is because you could throw down a lot with a few Ravens. Now, the thing is, if you make a cheap Raven and you keep the auto turret energy at 50, it's going to be too strong. And you're just going to be able to spam Ravens and it's going to be really strong, especially in TVT. So I would rather have seen maybe try to make it with another ability instead, because I feel like either at 50 it's too strong, at 75 it's too useless, and I'm pretty sure about this. Like, I saw some people in my Twitch chat the other day being like, oh man, people are gonna spam Ravens, they're so cheap. But the Ravens now, they have a good attack. You can drop a lot of auto turrets. After this change, you're not gonna have a lot of auto turrets at all. You're going to have 10 Ravens, drop 20 turrets, and have no single other ability available. It's just not that great. So this is the change I like the least. I feel like they either could have replaced it with something else, or made it a stronger auto turret for 75 energy, or a weaker auto turret for 50 energy. But keeping the same auto turret strength and make it 75 energy, like, you're just not going to want to use that. It's just going to be a very bad ability. Now, Interference Matrix is going to be cut. Duration is going to be cut by 3 seconds. And the armor missile is going to be cut by 1 armor. So it's going to reduce armor by 2 instead of 3. So it's basically just going to be a cheaper Raven that has worse abilities. And I think I actually really like this change. Mostly because it is really hard to fit a Raven into a build. It was 43 seconds and 200 gas. So you really needed to have a very specific build to fit in a Raven. It was really hard to get detection. Really hard to get a support unit like that. And now it's going to be a little bit easier to get a support unit. Even if it is weaker, you're going to be able to do way better builds with them. And I think overall it's going to be pretty nice. And I believe in TVT, another big benefit. Just to keep you guys, completely clear on what I'm talking about. TVT, the late game is supposed to be Raven Viking tank against Raven Viking tank, because pretty much nothing counters it. I mean, literally nothing counters it, I should say. And now, with the auto turret change, it is going to be a little bit weaker. And I think Mass Raven is not going to be as good. So that's going to be a good thing. Obviously, we're going to have to see how it all pays out. Now, the goals I had for this one, let me just reveal it. The first one, I mean, I kind of said it already, right? It's that I want more options, more entertainment. And that's what I get with changes like these. Maybe makes me use the Cyclone a bit more. This is going to make me use different build orders. Those changes I really like, so I definitely think that goal has been reached. Now, another goal I had for this balance patch, obviously I didn't make it, but that's what I would have liked it to achieve, is to shift balance away from Zerg a little bit. I think in that option, it definitely failed. Like I said, Zerg is a little bit too dominant at the high level. Zerg win every big tournament pretty much. And I would have liked to see maybe Zerg nerfed a little bit. Instead, it actually felt like they got buffed this patch. I got a lot of people in my Twitch chat saying, is it just me or is this a Zerg patch? But after reading all of it, I do have to agree it seems like a pretty good patch for Zerg. And I don't like it because Zerg is already really the best race at the top level. And I would have loved to see that change a little bit. And actually, I forgot what the third goal was, so I can't answer that right now. But overall, I'm really happy to get some changes. As a content creator, I'm really happy with some of the changes like this that allow me to do some new challenges maybe, have some more fun. And that's going to be about it for this. There's also a bunch of bug fixes. I'm not going to look at all of them, really. Some of them are actually kind of like nerfs and buffs hidden as a bug fix. For example, Widowmines and Cyclones no longer target Zerg eggs by their own, which is actually just like a little bit of a small buff, which is nice. I mean, it was always really annoying to have them target eggs and whatnot, so I think it's cool. But it's definitely a little bit of a buff rather than a bug fix. And there was also a pretty big nerf, I believe, which is the interference matrix. Now, or it's actually this one. If you get interference matrix and you don't micro, your units are just going to walk into the opponent's army if you A-move. So if you A-move an army with a Colossus and you interference matrix the Colossus can't attack. It walks into your army. And you can counter it by very simple micro. But now, they're only going to walk forward into their attack range, so they're not going to die anymore. Which is actually a pretty big nerf to the Raven, because that happens so often that people lose their Colossus for free. And it's very easily counterable by some micros, so this is a little bit funny to put that in a bug fix when it is a pretty big nerf. But all in all, it's a pretty good patch. They have a few really cool bug fixes, though. I saw one more. There was one that I wanted to highlight. I forgot which one it was. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Which one was it? Was it at the bottom, maybe? Don't quite remember which one it was, actually. So I guess that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys liked my thoughts on the patch. I think it's going to be really fun. Keep in mind, this patch is not 100% conclusive. This is a PTR. Changes are going to be made to this. And the patch also has no date yet. I hope it's going to come out sooner rather than later, but I don't know yet. But I guess we will see. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all for the next video. Adios.